Welcome to Net Zero Action Heroes, where we recognize the sustainability leaders driving real change at scale to turn the tide on climate change. Each episode, we interview an individual who's helping to build a more sustainable planet. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Net Zero Action Heroes. I'm Chris Pullum, and this episode is brought to you by Turntide Technologies, an award-winning sustainability company. Today, our guest is Matt Boyle, OBE, a leader in vehicle electrification affiliated with multiple UK organizations. Just to name a few, he is a consultant for Turntide Electrification. He's chairman of the Northeast Automotive Alliance, teaches at Newcastle University, and was recently named to Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Business Council. Matt, thanks for joining me today on Net Zero Action Heroes.
Thanks, Chris. I'm just worn out listening to all that.
And that's a very truncated version of your resume. You're affiliated with so many things. But before we dive into those specific roles that you have, I was hoping you could start by sharing your motivation for advancing sustainable technologies in your career. Why do you do it?
Well, it's really quite straightforward. It comes down to two words: climate change. Without these technologies, there is no chance of the world addressing the issues of climate change. We're too dependent on fossil fuels and too dependent on our lifestyle. And you can't square taking carbon out of the supply chain with continuing the lifestyle you've got. So you've got to use technology to help bridge that gap. And those technologies are all about the sustainable technologies that both Turntide use and develop, as well as a number of other companies I'm affiliated with.
So, with that being said, would you mind walking us through some highlights from your career and maybe a few of your current roles?
I used to run a US public company. I used to run a company called Sevcon, which was at the forefront of electric vehicle and drivetrain development. So the thing that sat between the power source, which was normally a battery, and the electric motor. And Sevcon was originally started in the 1960s. I'm not that old. I didn't found the company. I joined the company in 1996. Led the company for 21 years before we sold it to Borg Warner of the United States. And I became a kind of probably semi-retired person for, I would say, about 30 seconds. And then a number of people approached me to try and help the UK address the problems of climate change and the lack of manufacturing capability in those technologies in the UK. So I stopped being the president of a US public company and joined the staff of the UK government. I could only do that for a year, really, because it was a very finite job, but also I wanted to go on and get some stuff done. So started my own consultancy, helped Turntide come into the UK, 3 businesses, consolidated them. Then as parallel activities, I became a chair of one of the government funds, government projects, that sustainable technologies, as well as became a professor of practice at Newcastle University. So several parallel paths got me to where I am at the moment, all of which I've successfully juggled, in my opinion. But I'm now looking specifically at how we address the issues of climate change by making technologies, developing and making technologies that address that hole I was talking about in the drivetrain between carbon and non-carbon sustainable technologies. Still very positive about it.
Yeah, so there's so many different directions I would love to go with that answer. I guess my first direction would be, you're involved in so many different things, as you just mentioned. Why do we have to attack this problem from so many different directions to make any headway? Like, why are you involved in them?
So the internal combustion engine was developed over about 150 years. Constant development to get it to where it was at Euro 6. We don't have that time. We have got to solve the problem in far faster timescale than that. And that means that we have to address the problem from multiple angles in order to be successful in replacing carbon. And the UK government today published an energy policy which talks about hydrogen, it talks about nuclear, it talks about wind, it talks about solar, it talks about heat pumps. All of those technologies are underpinned, all of those solutions are underpinned by power electronics, machines and drives, which for the machines and drives bit was all about what I did for a living for the last 30 years. So I'm helping companies and governments address the needs in a kind of pincer movement, solve the problem of bridging the gap, but also solving the problem of developing supply chains, because we need lots of this stuff now. We don't have 150 years to develop the stuff. We have to be manufacturing the parts and the solutions in far quicker order.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like the government and businesses can really help each other if they're in sync and if they're working together as opposed to being in silos. So I think it's great that you're converging both of those aspects into one solution because, like you said, we don't have much time to solve this. So we need to be doing this efficiently as possible.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Chris. And one of the things you find is government is an enabler, but not a doer. Industry does, governments enable. And that's the correct levers to pull when you're dealing with both. I went to COP26 back in November last year, and it was fascinating to hear people talking about this stuff now in really with a sense of urgency. And I hadn't experienced that before, but it was hugely satisfying.
So have you noticed anything that's changed over the time since you got into sustainability tech to now?
I think 3 things. So let me talk about talent first. When I started in engineering, my cohort of graduating class people were almost all male. That has now changed, and that is for the good. Encouraging the entire panoplia of humanity to get involved in engineering has been one of my challenges over my career. It is a big church, engineering, and there are places for everyone. And over the last several years, I would say probably the last 5 to 10 years, I've seen a greater influx of women, girls into the science subjects and following it through to graduate engineering jobs and even technician jobs. I don't say even, they're as valuable. So that's the first thing. The second thing is a wake-up call, well, for the entire world, really, of how much damage we have done and how much damage we are doing to our climate. And that is not something that was talked about as much when I started off, but it wasn't discussed at all. But certainly in the last 5 or so years, 6 years, especially with COVID did help as well, because it allowed people to focus for a while, and it highlighted some of the challenges in COP26, highlighted some of the challenges that we still have. But that dialogue has started out. I was at a dinner with, who was it now? It was John, Secretary of State of the United States. He said the difference, he'd been going to all the COP26s, and he said, this one has been the first one where business has turned up. And because business turned up, because for its customers, it has now become an issue. And I strongly believe that boardrooms are more influenced by its customers than people think, because investors want the board to be interested in the customer, and the management want the board to be interested in the customer. And that is one of the reasons why turning up to COP26 as a business has been hugely important. And some of the commitments made there were made by businesses as well as governments.
Okay, so then, I mean, we've known about the impact of carbon emissions on climate change for decades, but carbon emission continues to go up, not down. In your view, what have been the major obstacles to decarbonizing?
Well, first of all, I would say lack of an alternative. One of the biggest polluters, 28% of it is transport. When you look at decarbonising transport, you look at the effect in that 28%, how much aerospace is, how much marine is, how much rail is, and how much the automobile is. And they're all pretty much of a muchness in their impact. But there hasn't been, up until fairly recently, a credible alternative to burning fossil fuels. Now there are a couple of alternatives. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we are lazy as a society and as a culture. This does require you to think differently and to act differently. And that's not something people do very often. People in general don't like change. And as you might imagine, I'm one of the largest exponents of switching to battery electric vehicles or hydrogen electric vehicles. And the first thing I get told is, oh, what about the range anxiety? Well, if you actually sit down and think about what your daily commute looks like, you'll never get close to the range of a battery electric vehicle. You'll be able to use it and recharge it, 4 or 5 times in a week. It's not really an issue. So there's laziness. And the third thing I would say is no incentive to change. So it is somewhat associated with laziness. The lack of incentive to change has been the hurdles to get change done are actually been quite high. So the cost of a sustainably powered vehicle is higher today than its internal combustion equivalent. But that's coming down. And governments are helping to leverage that by giving incentives to going sustainable technologies in some vehicles. And that incentive to change is hugely important because there is a market disconnect between what governments legislate and what people actually need to spend money on. It's all very well saying to your voter, you're going to have to be an electric vehicle by 2030. If there aren't electric vehicles around and they're very expensive, then there's no real incentive to change, is there? So I would say the three things are the laziness, the lack of an incentive, and the technological alternative.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a lot of ways, this incentive is coming down to just financial reasons. It doesn't even have to do with sustainability for some people anymore. And that's personally, that seems like a great thing.
I'll let you in on a little secret. So not only is it more cost effective to run an electric vehicle today, but the performance is better. So I am surrounded at times by people you describe as petrol heads. You know, they love their Ferraris, they love their McLarens, they love their Aston Martins. But you put them on a racetrack and the electric vehicle beats them hands down because the performance is better.
And there's still commercial and industrial vehicles. Do those two sources contribute significantly to climate change in terms of all of vehicle emissions?
Yeah, they do, especially commercial vehicles. So let me talk about commercial vehicles and trucking, first of all. Probably, I'd say about 25% of that total emissions comes down to large freight being moved long distances.
Mm-hmm.
There are automotive and the last mile logistics is horrendous. It's like 30%. You look at the last mile logistics and you think, why is that still carbon? Because by definition, the vehicles aren't going very far. You know, last mile logistics would imply that they're only going a mile. They tend to be lighter than the larger trucks, so it's easier to power them and give them an appropriately sized drivetrain. And the third thing is there is infrastructure, because last mile logistics is from a distribution warehouse or location to its ultimate customers. Around those, those tend to be urban. And around those, there's an enormous ability to charge, to recharge, and there's all the infrastructure to support that. So last mile logistics, I think, is one of the places where there's been a lot of attention recently. And one of my hats I wear is chairman of a 5G commercial connected automated logistics project, which is looking at last mile logistics on public highways. And there's some challenges there, obviously, but regulation not being the only one. But those smaller trucks can definitely be electrified today.
So, I mean, they can be electrified, but I mean, is there a business incentive? Like, what would be the argument for the companies from like a bottom line perspective to actually make this sort of transition?
So there are a couple of things that are interesting for me, and it's not simply the economics. There are now people around in last mile logistics who actually do think about the effect they're having on the planet's climate before they look at the economic model. And we can talk about UPS, we can talk about FedEx, we can talk about Amazon, all businesses which today, when they're tendering for commercial vehicles, one of the biggest things is how do you mitigate your effect on the climate? And that might be they're hybrid, but there's other offsets that take account of the internal combustion component of the hybrid system, or it's pure electric. And going back to my point about last mile logistics, when you talk about FedEx and UPS, and to a large extent Amazon, that is one of the things they are very good at, last mile logistics. And they look at these technologies now, looking to implement them in order to offset their climate impact. So it's not as black and white as saying, well, all of these people are now interested in the climate all of a sudden, but it is looking at the effect of the climate and the cost of running them. It's actually, and the performance, going back to what I was saying about performance, they actually perform better. So it's not only economic impact, they do factor in other things, but the economic impact to the bottom line is actually disappearing.
And I mean, the technology that powers these last mile vehicles, electric vehicles, is really fascinating. I mean, I've read about like the regenerative braking that adds more electricity,
Yep.
more power to the vehicles as they're driving, as they're going and
Mhm.
stopping at stoplights, stop signs, pick up and drop off locations. Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating. Is there any other interesting technology going into these vehicles that have kind of enabled their wide scale use?
So there are a couple of things. One thing in particular is direct drive. So instead of having an electric motor and a gearbox to drive a prop shaft, in other words, all the person designing the drivetrain has done is taken the internal combustion engine out and put an electrical system in. If you can configure it so that you don't need the gearbox and you can do direct drive, then that again improves performance because you don't have some of the losses in the gearbox. When you go direct drive, the overall efficiency of the system improves. The second thing I would draw your attention to is fuel cells. So fuel cells have been around for a while. When it first started at Sevcon 27 years ago, fuel cells were 10 years away. That's what I was told. They're 10 years away. That was nearly 30 years ago, and they're still not there yet, but they're improving. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that has certainly helped people understand the art of possible has been examples of where fuel cells have been implemented in commercial vehicles, trucks and buses being the two examples I would cite, that show that it can be part of the solution. And one thing I would stress to anybody watching this or anybody listening to me is there isn't a silver bullet in this. It will take a range of technologies applied in a range of applications to solve the problem. You cannot power everything with a battery, and you cannot power everything with a hydrogen fuel cell. So there are horses for courses, as they say. But all the technologies do exist today to do that. I think over the course of the next 10 years, I think those two technologies will substantially improve the ability to operate electric vehicles. The interesting one for me is aerospace. That there's a great deal of work going on at the moment in green fuels, alternative fuels to burning carbon. That has some impetus, some government support for that. And I think biofuels is potentially a solution to some of these things. But hydrogen might also play a part, and definitely batteries will, because they already do. So, as I said earlier, there's no silver bullet in this. And I see, 3 technologies or 4 technologies being around for quite some time yet.
I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about this issue from like an engineering perspective. We've talked a lot about like the end user perspective with UPS, Amazon, all those other companies. What's in it for, like, what are the business benefits for vehicle manufacturers to accelerate their electrification efforts?
As you look at OEMs, they are influenced by the customer, hugely influenced by the customer. So you'll have seen over the last 10 years, the fantastic advances in the man-machine interface, the bells and whistles in cars, ABS and all these things. But now they're faced with a different challenge. And the different challenge is, my son, who's 26, has declared he will never own a vehicle. He wants to hire it, wants to rent it on a day-to-day basis. Different business model. My daughter, who does want to own a vehicle, doesn't want to own an internal combustion vehicle, won't buy one. And that's the first generation, in my opinion, that has had that view of vehicle ownership. And that business model has changed in vehicle manufacturers, that how they approach the market, how they approach the customer, what type of business models they have to adopt and implement. It's all great, an enormous amount of change in automotive over the last 2 or 3 years, and a lot more to come.
On the political level, I'm curious, has the UK government been a good partner for you over there?
Yes, a couple of ways in which that's been the case. Very clear guidelines, very clear limits. Don't be wishy-washy about this stuff. There will be no more new internal combustion vehicles after 2030. There's a deadline. It's hard. Use well described, no ambiguity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the British government, as does the American government, understands that electrification is something that you didn't even think of 3 or 4 years ago. So you have to move quickly. And things like the UK energy strategy that was announced today, looking at generation through solar, wind, nuclear. Those are all components that governments influence. It's not simply, the consumer or even big business, because there are other implications of some of that stuff. Planning, the environment is not only the climate, it's also when you open your curtain in the morning and there's a great big windmill in front of you, do you go, or do you go, oh? Yeah. I know which one I do, by the way. I do that. Oh.
That's an interesting point.
But the British, it has been very helpful.
So I'd love to dive into some of the things that the UK government is doing and that you also are doing through the UK government. So one of them being the Leveling Up Initiative. Could you I've read a lot about it recently, but could you kind of share what that is?
Right. So think about this. I think about this slightly differently from the media. And I think I'm right in saying this. No doubt they'll tell me I'm wrong at some point. But leveling up is about the level of opportunity. So in the UK, as there are in many societies across the globe, there are pockets of deprivation is not the right term, but it's lower incentive and lower achieving parts of society are geographically spread. And what leveling up is designed to do is to give those places the same level of opportunity as you would do in, say, Southern England. So somebody in Glasgow has the same opportunity to exceed and excel as somebody living in London. That's what leveling up is supposed to do. Now, there are many, many levers to pull in leveling up. Financial is one of them, but there are others, including planning laws, including access to education, including access to health. There are many facets to it, but leveling up ultimately is you get the same opportunity in one location as another. So a nice homogeneous environment to grow up and live and work in.
A lot of the organizations that you are affiliated with are based in the Northeast. So there's obviously a lot of activity over there. I was curious. So Turntide published a blog post a few weeks ago, kind of talking about all the reasons that the Northeast is one of the most exciting tech hubs in the UK. But you're the expert. What advantages does the Northeast have when it comes to vehicle electrification?
So one word, capability. I've preached for many decades now. There are 3 places in the world to do electrification.
Mm-hmm.
Only 3. Northern Italy, northeast of the United States, not the West Coast, northeast of the United States, and the northeast of the UK. And partly that's down to history. And history in northern Italy is after the Second World War. The rebuilding of Europe incentivized places like Italy to get hold of something it was quite good at and try and build it. And there are a number of kind of household names in electrification and electrical supply and machines, especially in northern Italy, that have over the years done 2 things. One, they've grown as businesses, but they've created an environment around them, an ecology around them that supports their own growth. And that is where investment has gone for those technologies. So as we've gone through the Cinderella stage, in all 3 locations, they've all benefited from the fact that they have capability. The other thing you have to do, though, Chris, is you have to bring investment, and you have to make it very friendly, that investment, make it easy for people to come here and exploit the capability. And that's one of the things, going back to your point about the British government, that's one of the other things that the British government has done, is it's made it easy to do business successfully in the UK. So thirdly, specifically about the northeast of England, is we've seen over the past 2 years, huge investments in both natural capability, because there have been some sites in the UK, in northeast of England, that have lent themselves very handily to location for big battery plants. And we've now got 3 gigafactories. Now, a gigafactory is a factory that produces more than a gigawatt hour of batteries in a year. We already have one, but we have Europe's first, and that's in Washington. We're adding to that one, and that's the envisioned £480 million investment, follow on 1.2 billion in that, and so that will be £1.6 billion of investment, and the British Volt investment, which is 1.8 billion thereabouts. So, and they've come here for 2 things. One, the capability in the region, very high tech infrastructure and ecology. And secondly, huge natural resources, both in its ability to generate the power required for the gigafactories and to have the talent around that can staff them. And those really are the two reasons why the Northeast has benefited from investments that have been going on for the best part of 40 years.
Yeah, so are there any specific programs or initiatives that could have kind of encouraged this, whether it's in the UK or in the Northeast specifically? I know, for example, like the Driving the Electric Revolution program could drive some of these advancements.
So I am chair, one of my hats is chair of the Driving the Electric Revolution Industrialization Centres. And one of the centres is based in the Northeast. There are 4 centres across the country, but the one in the Northeast is specifically looking at drives machines in the kind of up to about 250 kilowatts, which is a sweet spot for automotive.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those technologies, those manufacturing capabilities in the Northeast can be exploited by people from anywhere in the world, but especially in the UK. And we've got capability here to allow businesses to experiment without breaking the bank. Government has put money into putting equipment into the UK to fill gaps in the supply chains, to allow big business to come along and play with some toys that it needs for the future before it has to invest. That does 2 things. One, it allows businesses to invest smartly in the fullness of time, but also it builds capability because their employees get to use the technology before they've invested in it, kind of work out what works and what doesn't work, and it's totally de-risked.
And I would also like to ask about a couple of the other organizations that you're affiliated with and just see what their impacts are in the region. So the chair of the Northeast Automotive Alliance.
So the Northeast Automotive Alliance is an alliance of the supply chains and the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers. So Nissan's a big member. What it does is it supports the supply chain for the car plant. There are 300 businesses inside the alliance. It has the OEM, it has all of its tier 1s, all of its tier 2s, most of its tier 3s. And what you then find is that people are a little bit nervous talking about their business in open forum. And what the alliance does is, without need to divulge anything, you can discuss your challenges, you can discuss problems you have, you can discuss where technology is going, so on and so forth, in an environment that's benign. It's everybody, Chatham House rules, everybody leaves their ideas and the prejudices at the main gate. And it really came into focus, actually, how good this alliance was during COVID. Because, as you might imagine, the lockdowns across the world adversely affected supply chains for all of these businesses. And they all shared best practice. We chaired daily, at one point, meetings to discuss what best practice was in dealing with COVID in the workplace, mitigation strategies, some of the cleanup technologies, some of the HR issues around testing and so on and so forth. And that's what the Alliance was all about. It's about sharing ideas and helping each other solve problems.
Yeah, that sounds like a great approach to it. I think it's easy to imagine that a lot of these businesses would just be competing with each other and not kind of want to share any of the secrets or their solutions they come up with. But I could also see the alternative where, tapping these solutions together could benefit everybody involved. So,
yeah, absolutely.
And then
the chairman, as a chairman, all I do is shut up and just let them talk. Great
sounds
job.
Like an easy gig. Kidding, obviously. There's also the Common Room of the Great North. Could you tell me about that organization a little bit?
I'm in it at the moment. It is a wonderful building. So Neville Hall, I need to take you back to the start of the first industrial revolution, when the UK started digging out coal. It started digging out coal in this region. Enormous. The northern coalfield was enormous. And Neville Hall was built by the people who owned the mines. So all the mine owners got together and built a building to do kind of 3 things. First of all, was to house the North of England Institute of Mining and Mechanical Engineering, NIME. Now, I'll come back to NIME in a second. The second thing it did was going back to what the Alliance does, it got everybody in a room to address the problems of all of the mining communities, not just individual mine owners having a problem that they decide they want to fix. And then the last thing, it was a location for debate. So some of the people, especially in electrification, some of the people who were past presidents of this place were people like Lord Armstrong, who was the very first person to put in a light bulb in a domestic location. He was also the very first person to use hydropower to power a building. But the Mining Institute was an institute of coal miners. And through, I think, 150 years now of developing fossil fuel alternatives and being at the forefront of mining technology, the building is now passed over to the Common Room of the Great North, whose mission is to both safeguard the collection, and I'll come back to the collection in the Mining Institute in a second, to safeguard the collection, but also to open the building for debate of the challenges of now and the future. Mm-hmm. So some of the debates, for example, here, I like to explain it like this. You leave your prejudices at the door. You open your mind as you open the door, and you sit down and debate, discuss from a point of knowledge, not just what your gut feel tells you, because my experience of gut feels are generally wrong. So I've said twice now that I would hold off on the Mining Institute and the collection. Mm-hmm. We have in this building an enormous treasure trove of history associated with mining and mechanical engineering. Like, we have a book, full set of drawings of the Eiffel Tower given to us by Carl Eiffel in order to ensure that the mechanical engineering was top notch. Sir Humphrey Davy's, so the Davy lab, this is a coal miner's lab, a safety lab. Mm-hmm. We have a collection of all the ones that didn't pass muster or didn't solve the problem, as well as the one that eventually did. And I was talking about, an hour or two ago, about how innovation and failure go hand in glove, because without failure, there is no innovation. Well, likes of me, I've failed far too many times, but I've innovated a fair few times as well. And I'd rather focus on the positive than the negative, but without failure, there is no innovation. So the Common Room of the Great North it's an idea. It sits in a building that it owns and runs, and it's got a set of great objectives that are all about solving the problems that, in its eyes, it created well over 150 years ago now.
Yeah, so projecting that forward, like, what role does this space play in kind of solving the problems of today?
Debate, discussion. As we've already discussed, we sit in a place that has enormous capability in these technologies, that's at the forefront of the decarbonisation technologies that the world needs. Now, like you said earlier on, there isn't a silver bullet. You have to continue the discussion, continue the enlightenment. One of the other things that the Common Room does, I've just come from a conference, it looks at things like ED&I, because I am the face of engineering for the last 150, 200 years, but I'm not the future of it. It needs to be far more inclusive, far more diverse. And I said to you earlier on about the number of kids and the number of girls getting into STEM education, STEM subjects. Absolutely enthralling to see it beginning to pay some fruit. But it's been a long time coming. And that's the other objective of the Common Room, is to try and promote science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to an entire new generation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've kept you for a while, so I only have one more specific question for you. What makes you hopeful for the future?
I think it's a bit more complex for me, but what I feel confident about and feel secure in is that the kids coming through now, doing engineering, wanting to follow a path in science and technology, hugely inspiring. I mean, it may have been that being in that cohort, the best part 40 years ago, I didn't see it in any of my peers. But today I look into the schools, the colleges, the universities, and I'm hugely encouraged by the potential of the people who are coming through in these subjects now. And at last, we're seeing decarbonisation as being an imperative. That is enormously satisfying to me.
Yeah, that's really heartening. So before I let you go, where can people go to learn more about you or any of these organizations you mentioned?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, but isn't everybody? Yeah, I'm also, as I already said, a professor of practice at Newcastle. I'm sure Newcastle will picture of me on a dartboard somewhere. But the easiest way to get to me is through LinkedIn.
Awesome. So, well, Matt, thanks again for everything you're doing to make the world more sustainable. You've been a fantastic addition to Net Zero Action Heroes. It was a pleasure getting to know you and everything that you're doing over there in the UK.
Thanks very much, Chris. You have a better afternoon.
It won't get better from here. Thank you.
Thanks for checking out this episode of Net Zero Action Heroes. This show is brought to you by Turntide Technologies, an award-winning sustainability company. If you enjoyed this episode, then follow Net Zero Action Heroes wherever you get your favorite podcasts, or join us online at turntide.com/heroes for all of our latest episodes.